the passage makes a few key arguments. It says there are entire disciplines of scientists who participate in communities of colleagues. So scientific communities, communities of colleagues where scientists participate in. Internally, these communities are said to be arranged in status hierarchies within which researchers make reciprocal but non-contractual gift-like exchanges of original information. Scientists make contributions to their community of knowledge. They give papers to symposia and acknowledge one another in them. So we first see that in the context of scientists and scientific disciplines, the passage is telling us that there are communities of colleagues. Why are these communities called communities? Because they're said to be arranged in status hierarchies. What does that mean, status hierarchies? Two things. First, the researchers here in these communities make reciprocal but non-contractual gift-like exchanges of original information. First off, this is original information. We're talking about scientists here. We're talking about information regarding their research. That is shared by them. And not just that, these are reciprocal. So there is not just an exchange, but an interchange of information. And then these are non-contractual gift-like exchanges. So non-contractual means that these are not mandatory. These scientists are not bound. They are not legally bound or bound in any way to make these exchanges, but they do so because there is this sense of community. The second reason is this: scientists make contributions to their community of knowledge. They give papers to symposia and acknowledge one another in them. So yes, they give papers to symposia. That is the process in which the information is disseminated or exchanged or interchanged. That is all right. But acknowledge one another. That is another reason why we say there is a community here, because people acknowledge other people. Scientists acknowledge other scientists in their work, which also causes, this is a very significant point, as we would see from the subsequent statements after this. So in all of this, we realize there are three significant factors other than the context, which is disciplines containing scientists. We have communities, and communities because there are status hierarchies where researchers make these reciprocal non-contractual gift-like exchanges of information, and they also acknowledge one another in their work. Then the passage says, crudely stated, what enlivens this system is recognition incentives from within the discipline. And we can see that the recognition comes from acknowledgement. So the incentives of recognition, that is what we see in terms of recognition incentives, acknowledgement relating to recognition. And recognition, that leads to funding. Recognition facilitates access to funding. But the primary currency in science is said to be social and intellectual rather than financial. This last statement is quite logical. This is like a conclusion to the given information. Recognition facilitates access to funding. So recognition is important. Funding is important because that keeps the work rolling, that keeps the work going. The research continues. Without funding, it would stop. So the financial currency is there, but in the scientific community, the social and intellectual currency is considered to be more important. It's the primary currency. Why? Because intellectual, this is scientific information, the scientific community, scientists. So obviously they deal with intellectual property and intellectual currency, but the social, because there is this sense of community among these scientists. And these scientists, because of these gifts of information, exchanges of information, and this acknowledgement, they create what is said to be recognition. Recognition then facilitates funding, access to funding. So the aspect of community is the most important thing here. The social aspect is the most important thing here. That's what the passage is suggesting. Let's look at the options. A says, scientists in various fields let's do this. Scientists in various fields take part in communities where members make gift-like contributions of knowledge, bringing in recognition and access to funding. Even though social and intellectual currency has greater significance. Now, this seems like a valid answer. It has most of the key aspects down. It has two slight problems. The first problem is it doesn't talk about acknowledgement. And we have seen how there are two aspects which make this aspect of community significant. One is the exchanges of original information, and second is the acknowledgement. And acknowledgement directly leads to recognition incentives, which leads to funding. So the first thing that we see is acknowledgement of scientists, one another in their work, is not mentioned in this option. It is somewhat hinted at because we are talking about social currency here. But then it can be directly mentioned. Because it is not, we can call this just slightly, a tad limited. The second problem is a distortion in this line itself. We say that there is bringing in recognition and access to funding. In the word "and," the connection between recognition and access to funding is sort of obviated. It is recognition that facilitates access to funding. So access to funding comes from recognition. But then in general, we can say that if there is recognition built, recognition incentives, they bring in recognition and also funding. So there's nothing technically wrong with this. The phrasing can be a little better, but what is given in A is not technically wrong. So there are a few problems, but otherwise we can qualify A. It's a decent enough answer. Option B says, scientists in various disciplines participate in communities where they make non-mandatory contributions of information, facilitating access to funding through recognition, even though the social and intellectual currency have greater value. Now, here we find that the same problem as one of the problems as A exists. We talk about the social currency, but we don't talk about acknowledgement of scientists in each other's work. We do have the other option or the other problem fixed. Here we said bringing in recognition and access to funding. Here it says facilitating access to funding through recognition. So recognition leading to access to funding, which is a better phrasing, which is closer to the passage than option A. So we realize that while the first problem, the aspect of acknowledgement not being mentioned here, it still causes this to be just a small bit limited. We do have a better phrasing of the statements, at least that one phrase, as compared to option A. So we qualify option B and by comparison eliminate A because B gets one of the things better, does it better than option A. So far B seems like the answer. Option C tells us communities of scientists are arranged in status hierarchies and thus make voluntary contributions of information and acknowledgement, supporting the system by creating recognition which facilitates access to funding. Now, this is somewhat complex. We see first off that there is a better phrasing of this as compared to B. We see communities of scientists, which simplifies scientists in various disciplines participate in communities. Communities of scientists are arranged in status hierarchies. So this just manages to get this word or this phrase into the summary. And these make voluntary contributions of information and acknowledgement. Information, what we see here, exchanges of information, and acknowledgement also covers this part of the argument. This is something that was somewhat referenced in the other options, but never directly mentioned. Here, it directly mentions acknowledgement. Supporting the system, that is also what we talk about enlivens the system by creating recognition which facilitates access to funding. So recognition facilitating access to funding is also a direct reference to the last statement. So we find that what it includes, whatever it includes, C has much better phrasing than B does. There is one problem though. B talks about this last phrase, the social and intellectual currency having greater value as compared to the financial one. This is omitted in option C. Option C is just about 3 words larger than option B. Is that a valid problem? Should we eliminate C, call it limited, because it doesn't talk about this aspect? Not necessarily. One, acknowledgement is a more important, more significant argument, because that is one of the reasons why we at all call these communities of colleagues communities. So the first statement of the passage defines communities, and acknowledgement of scientists in each other's work, that is one aspect of community. So this is a very defining factor from the premise. And then when we say the last phrase says the currency in science is said to be social and intellectual, rather than financial. We are only recapping, we are concluding what has been stated in the passage. We have seen how the intellectual property refers to scientists and scientific information. Social refers to communities. Financial refers to funding. So overall, this argument is already included, which means if it is omitted from a summary, it's not a big problem at all. And when we are in particular talking about not just exchange of information and acknowledgement, we are talking about the social aspect of the social currency of these communities. When we say communities of scientists and information, we are talking about the intellectual aspect, and the financial aspect has been talked about in funding. So we realize that C is actually, by comparison, the best option. So we qualify C, and by comparison, we eliminate B. Option D says, scientific communities are structured by echelons of status in which members make contributions of information and knowledge, supporting the system by creating recognition which facilitates access to financial sponsorship. Now, this compared to C is still limited. It doesn't talk about acknowledgement. It doesn't talk about what we have here in status hierarchies. It talks about make contributions of information and knowledge, supporting the system by creating recognition which facilitates. So it doesn't talk about acknowledgement. We've seen how C is better on that front. So we can eliminate D. The correct answer is option C.